The ayes have it. Questions without notice. Are there any questions? And I call the honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the Coalition has ruled out paying compensation to other nations for the effects of climate change. Will the Albanese government also rule out signing Australia up to compensating other countries as part of the deal being negotiated at COP27 in Egypt?
Member for Hunter. The Minister for Climate Change. I'll give the call to the Prime Minister. Order. Members on my left, the question has been asked in silence. Order. The Minister for Cyber Security. The member for Moreton. The Prime Minister will be heard in silence. And I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. One of the things I won't do is, in front of a boom mic, make a joke about our island neighbours down there. That's one of the things that I won't do. I won't do that. And I won't do that because I want to build good relations with our Pacific neighbours. And one of the things that we provided for in the budget for all there to see.
Member for Hunter.
And if the Leader of the Opposition wants to have a look at the budget papers, we've made it very clear that one of the things that we will do is provide support for our Pacific Island neighbours for infrastructure that needs to be dealing with because of the threat that countries like Tuvalu and Kiribati are experiencing. One of the things that we saw during the election campaign, Mr Speaker, was the Solomon Islands, and was front and centre of the campaign. The fact that Australia, unfortunately, has stepped back, and other nations with the strategic competition that's occurring in our region have stepped in. One of the things we need to be very conscious of is that climate change is indeed a national security issue. That is something that is recognised by the United States. It's something that's recognised by our other partners and indeed our allies. It's something that was recognised in the Quad Leaders meeting. The first thing I did as Prime Minister was get on a plane and visit Tokyo to meet with Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden. And there we spoke about the responsibility that we have as leaders of developed nations to engage in our region, in Southeast Asia, in the Indo-Pacific. So what we won't be doing, Mr Speaker, is trying to score a cheap domestic political point and at the same time—
Order. Members on my left.
And at the same time actually set back our international relations. So you can't say you care about strategic competition in the region whilst you continue with this sort of position. No wonder that Senator Wong has had to work so hard to restore Australia's standing in our region.
Order. I give the call to the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. As the COP27 climate change conference gathers, what action is the Albanese government taking on climate change?
Give the call. The member for Herbert. The House will come to order. The member was heard in silence. The Prime Minister will be heard in silence, and I give him the call. Thanks
very much, and I thank the best ever member for Higgins for her question. Can I say this, that the COP27, the UN Climate Change Conference, has begun at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and it will sit for the coming fortnight. And it sits in a context where it comes after the hottest decade on record. And indeed, the past 8 years are on track to be the 8 warmest on record. Think about that. Every one of the 8 hottest years on record is the last 8 years. The last 8 years. And what we've seen, of course, not just the impact of this with the devastating floods in places like Pakistan. We don't actually have to look offshore. We can look here at the increase number of extreme weather events and the increase in the severity of them. Just before question time, I was speaking to the member for Riverina about Forbes in his electorate that we visited just a couple of weeks ago. We visited as the flood waters were going down. Now they've gone up again, and fortunately for the people of Forbes who've done it so tough, they've gone down again. I visited just a week ago Lismore with the New South Wales Premier, where we're actually having to buy homes to move them out of the floodplain because people do not feel safe in those communities. We've had the devastating bushfires, including in areas of rainforests that had never burnt ever before. And we have the Secretary of the UN say last night, the science is clear. Any hope of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees means achieving global net zero emissions by 2050. But that 1.5 degree goal is on life support and the machines are rattling. Well, this parliament, the major parties apparently are all agreed on net zero by 2050, are all agreed, except for the rhetoric, and you wouldn't know it if you follow the statements that are aimed. So our government is acting. One of our first acts was to sign up to our changed nationally determined contribution of 43% by 2030. We've enshrined in law net zero by 2050, and we're investing in renewable energy. Climate change is a challenge for our generation, but it's also a challenge that we need to work with the rest of the world on.
Order. There is far too much noise on my right and my left, and I give the call to the member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How much will wholesale electricity prices need to fall to deliver the promised $275 reduction in bills for Australian families?
The member for Hunter will cease interjecting. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for her question, and I refer, of course, to the government's position on renewables and on taking action, because we do need to act to ensure that we can reduce power prices that are under pressure from the 23 now, if you count the latest thought bubble on nukes, energy policy of those opposite over a wasted decade, but also the invasion by Russia on Ukraine. Now, the budget made a significant start on that. Nearly $24 billion investment in clean energy, including Marinus Link, the interconnector between Tasmania and Victoria, Battery of the Nation, pumped hydro in Tasmania, 6 renewable energy zones created, legislating to create Australia's offshore wind industry, 400 community batteries. We've given the ACCC,
the Manager of Opposition on a point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, on relevance, you have previously directed a minister to deal with the terms of the question. I ask you uphold that ruling. It's a very tight question. The question was, what has to happen to wholesale prices? How much will wholesale electricity prices need to fall? And the Prime Minister should be directed to that question.
On the order, members on my right, I will call the Leader of the House on. I'll hear from him.
To the point of order, the Manager of Opposition Business didn't complete the question that was asked, which, as I recall, went specifically to the impact on family electricity bills, and the Prime Minister is answering quite directly on ways of impacting on that.
Yes, the question was also about wholesale prices, and I'm listening. Oh, I was ruling on the point of order, but I'll hear from the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Just to the point of order, the Leader of Government Business has suggested that there was some other part to this question, which is not the case. The question was very tight. How much will wholesale electricity prices need to fall to deliver the promised $275 reduction in bills for Australian families? It couldn't have been any tighter than that, Mr Speaker, and the Prime Minister should be asked to
Thank
answer
you.
the question,
you may resume
how
your
much
seat.
will wholesale electricity prices need to be?
Thank you. You may resume your seat. The Prime Minister is not halfway through his answer. The question was specific. I'm going to ask him to return to the question. He is setting some context, but I'll be listening carefully to his answer to make sure he addresses the issue of wholesale prices. And I call the Prime Minister.
About wholesale prices. And wholesale
Order.
wholesale prices will, of course, increase by up to 20% as a result of information that the former government kept quiet. Indeed, they legislated to make sure that people didn't know what would happen with wholesale prices. What we won't do is legislate so that people won't find out anything until
the Leader of the Nationals
after the next election, which is what the government did.
And I give the call to the member for Lalor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. What was the former coalition government's approach to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and what impact has this had on Australians?
I give the call to the Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Lalor for her question, which reflects her long-standing interest in the very important work of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. If you want to know about the approach of the former government and about the damage that the former government did to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, you can now ask the former government, because they might actually tell you. Over recent weeks, those opposite, including the opposition leader, have complained that the AAT is stacked with political appointees.
He does not have the call. Members on my right, I would like to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business in silence.
Mr Speaker, this question makes no attempt to even be related to the Attorney-General's portfolio. It's specifically worded in terms of the previous government.
Members on my
the
right.
Attorney-General is not responsible for the actions of the previous government. He has his own responsibilities, and that's what he ought to be asked about.
Order. On the point of order, I'll hear from the Leader. The member for Moreton, I'll call the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the point of order was not raised at the time of the question being asked. We're now well into the answer. The only point of order would be if he was being relevant to it or not at this point, and he's clearly being exactly relevant to what was asked.
The Attorney-General is being relevant. He does have responsibility for the AAT, but order. I will listen to his answer carefully to make sure it relates to the question.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Over recent weeks, those opposite, including the opposition leader, have complained that the AAT is, his words, stacked with political appointees who can't be trusted to approve warrants for the proposed new National Anti-Corruption Commission. Those opposite appear to have no sense of irony at all. According to the opposition leader, the members of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal lack the independence and requisite level of oversight and intellect to perform the important role of approving warrants, even though, as Minister for Home Affairs, this same Leader of the Opposition dramatically expanded the role of AAT members in issuing warrants. For the benefit of the Opposition Leader, yes, the AAT is stacked with political appointees, and that's because he and his colleagues spent almost a decade stacking the AAT with political appointees. They are attacking their own miserable record. The Opposition Leader and his colleagues are now openly admitting what many of us have been saying for years. The modern Liberal Party cares so little for vulnerable people who rely on the AAT that they are happy to stack it with Liberal cronies, almost 90 Liberal Party cronies at taxpayers' expense, many of whom they knew were not up to the job. Each year, tens of thousands of Australians rely on the AAT to independently review decisions made by Commonwealth departments and ministers that have major and sometimes life-altering impacts on their lives. Those opposite do not care about those Australians. Those opposite have never cared about those Australians, and they never will. And just yesterday we heard some more troubling revelations about the internal culture of the AAT after almost 10 years of Liberal Party stacking. 17 current members of the tribunal have faced bullying, discrimination or harassment complaints since the 1st of July 2016, and one of those members has had at least 5 such complaints made against them. That is completely unacceptable and is yet another problem that our government will have to address. The Liberal Party of Australia deserves to be tarnished forever for the legacy of this uniquely disgraceful exhibition of political cronyism, which has come at enormous cost to taxpayers, to the AAT and to Australia's system of administrative law more generally.
Order. The House will come to order so I can hear the member for Curtin in silence. I give her the call.
My question is for the Prime Minister. Australia has a history of complex industrial relations regulation, and the multi-employer bargaining part of the Secure Jobs Better Pay Bill is making many employers very nervous. Wages will not increase if businesses and their employees have to navigate an even more complex wage-setting system full of unintended consequences. What does the government think is more important, getting this bill passed urgently or getting it right?
I'll give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Curtin for her question and for her engagement constructively with the government. We had a meeting earlier today in which these issues were canvassed and raised, and I'm always happy to meet with members of the crossbench, as I am with anyone in this parliament who has serious policy issues to raise. The fact is that the government that I lead was elected with a mandate to increase people's wages. We went to an election and can't have been clearer. And we also can't have been clearer either in a speech I gave to the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Sydney during the election campaign. I spoke about the need to get bargaining operating effectively. I spoke about the fact that productivity was flatlining over a considerable period of time, and that, as the Reserve Bank Governor had indicated, that we had a circumstance whereby wages just simply weren't keeping up. And that was actually holding back the economy. That's a constraint on the economy. Now, what we've been doing with the industrial relations legislation is making sure that we consulted not just during that period, not just after we came to office, but at the Jobs and Skills Summit, in the lead-up to the legislation being moved by the Minister for Workplace Relations, and then during the inquiry that's taking place into the legislation, and also prior to the legislation being debated in this chamber. And as a result of that consultation extensively, there are a range of amendments that will be moved by the government. We do want to make sure that we get this right, but we also want to make sure that wages get moving, because we understand the pressure that family budgets are under, and we understand that you can't have a circumstance whereby, particularly, it is feminised industries, our cleaners, our childcare workers, our aged care workers, our disability care workers, the heroes of the pandemic who deserve something more than our thanks. They deserve an increase in their wages. And that's why what our industrial relations legislation is aimed at doing, working effectively, constructively with the business community, consulting with COSBOA, ACCI, the BCA, the Australian Industry Group, and anyone else who wants to engage with us on that legislation. So I would encourage the member and other members to contribute constructively to it. We're certain that we'll get it right, and we're certain that we'll get it done.
I'll give the call to the member for Macon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. What failures over the last decade have led to defence capability gaps, and what is the Albanese Labor government's plan to address them?
I give the call to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the member for his question. Australia faces capability gaps in our defence because of the complete incompetence of the former coalition government, and it was all based on the way in which they governed themselves. 6, almost 7 defence ministers in the course of 9 years. Started with David Johnson, who served just over a year, when, as the champion of Australian defence industry, he announced to the world that he wouldn't trust the defence industry of our country to build a canoe. Then we had Kevin Andrews, who went off and pursued a submarine deal with Japan, which in turn became a subject of the empty chair challenge on Tony Abbott. Kevin Andrews lost his job as Defence Minister when Tony Abbott lost his job as the Prime Minister. And then we had Senator Payne, and everything stopped. Literally, nothing happened. After the 2016 election, Christopher Pyne was brought in to be the human defibrillator machine to shock coalition defence policy back into life. But then we had two defence ministers at the same time, and no one had any idea who was responsible for what. That was never going to last, and so Christopher took over the entire show until he got sick of it in 2019. Then we had Senator Payne. Then we had the current leader of the opposition. Over the course of 9 years, 24 different ministers across the breadth of the defence portfolio. Is there any wonder that the result of that was absolute chaos? 28 different projects running a combined total of 97 years over time. The only thing that moved in the last decade was defence ministers, because everything else came to a grinding halt. But you don't need to take my word for it, because last week we had an outbreak of honesty from the Shadow Minister, the member for Canning, when he said, and I quote, "We also squandered a lot of opportunity through leadership changes. It created ministerial churn," one description of it, "which led to inertia." Well, he got that right, because that inertia described the single worst national security government in our country's history. Now, over the last few months, the Albanese Labor government has established the Defence Strategic Review, the single most expansive overview of defence in more than 35 years, so that in the context of a growing defence budget, we can have the capabilities that we need to meet a very different world. And we're going to actively manage programs to meet that need, because the Albanese Labor government is absolutely committed to getting defence back on track and keeping Australians safe.
Order. There is far too much noise on my right when ministers are addressing the House. Including the Minister for Indigenous Australians. And I give the call to the member for Hume.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Before the election, the Prime Minister promised Australians cheaper mortgages. Can the Prime Minister inform Australians how much the cash rate has increased since May 21?
Order. The member for Hume was heard in silence for his question. The Prime Minister. I call the Prime Minister.
I'll ask the Treasurer to answer the question, but we're not going to take lectures from the lightweight on the hill over there.
Order. Order. The Treasurer may resume his seat. Order. Until the House comes to order, I won't hear the Manager of Opposition Business. I call the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, Mr Speaker, that is clearly unparliamentary language, and he should be asked to withdraw.
I honestly could not hear what the Prime Minister was saying because of the yelling in the chamber. Order. I'm going to call the Treasurer and I'm going to ask the House to come to order. There is far too much noise. I'm issuing a general warning for the entire House. And I call the Treasurer.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. With questions that bad, is it any wonder he hardly ever gets one, Mr Speaker, in this place? Now, it might not have dawned on the Shadow Treasurer, nor on the dregs of the former government, which are arrayed before us, that—
Order. Order. I'm asking the Treasurer to resume his seat, but I ask the Manager to resume his seat. I just ask the Treasurer not to use that language when referring to the former government, either as the former government or former members of the government. And I call the Treasurer.
Would leftovers be parliamentary, Mr Speaker?
I'm asking the Treasurer to get on with his answer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the Shadow Treasurer for a very rare and particularly bad question. Because as everybody else in this House knows, interest rates started going up on their watch. And interest rates started going up for a range of reasons, from the extraordinary lows that they were at 0.1%, and they're currently at 2.85%, as every member of this House knows, except perhaps the Shadow Treasurer. Now, if the Shadow Treasurer had any credibility whatsoever, he would acknowledge, first of all, that rates started going up on the former government's watch, and secondly, he would say what members over there said when they started going up during the election, which was interest rates were not going to be at 0.1% forever. And so what we've done, Mr Speaker, and one of the reasons why we're proud of the budget we handed down 2 weeks ago, and the Shadow Treasurer won't ask me any questions about the budget that was handed down 2 weeks ago. But what we did in that budget was we made sure that we weren't making the inflation problem worse. In fact, we showed remarkable spending restraint, real spending growth was flat, we banked the upward revenue revisions, and we invested in the supply chain issues which were pushing inflation up in our economy. And that's why I was asked about interest rates.
The member for Hume will cease interjecting, otherwise I won't call the Manager of Opposition Business. The Treasurer may resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business, and I'd ask him to state the point of order.
On relevance, very direct question. Australians were promised cheaper mortgages. That was your promise. What are you doing about it?
Yes, and the Treasurer is referring to interest rates, which in my understanding is linked to mortgages. So I call the Treasurer.
Well, you're already far ahead of the Shadow Treasurer, Mr Speaker, if you make that link, and far ahead of the Manager of Opposition Business. Because the point that I'm making, Mr Speaker, is that the budget we handed down 2 weeks ago was aimed fairly and squarely at this inflation challenge in our economy, which is pushing up interest rates. Inflation was a problem before the election. Interest rates were going up before the election. They have absolutely no credibility if they won't acknowledge that.
I give the call to the order. I give the call to the member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Aged Care. Aged care workers have long been underpaid for work that they do in support of our most vulnerable people. How important is the Fair Work Commission's decision toward these dedicated workers a pay rise?
Good question. Give the call to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport.
Well, I thank the member for Hasluck for her question. This pay rise is vitally important because it will help us recruit and retain the staff that we need to reform a sector left to ruin by those opposite. A wage rise for aged care workers isn't just the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do, because the National Skills Commission's own analysis tells us that by a pay rise of 10% going to aged care workers, we will halve the staff shortages that we have in aged care by 2052. Not just the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. It was a crippling problem. There's a deserving solution, and still the Morrison government did nothing. And they did nothing for years and years and years. Aged care workers were left to languish, earning less than they would have earned stacking shelves at the supermarket. They were left to languish without hope of a pay rise. They were left to languish without any kind of respect, and they were left on the front line of COVID without adequate protection. And like the PM says, they don't just deserve our thanks, they deserve a pay rise. And now, for some aged care workers, after literally decades in the job that they love, they are about to crack the $30 an hour barrier for the very first time. And it's not just those of us on this side of the House that are applauding Fair Work's decision. Aged Care Community Care Providers Association Chief Tom Simonson said this substantial move was a step forward towards long-lasting reform that provides a higher quality of care for older Australians, enabling them to live their best lives. Stuart Brown partner, Grant Corduroy, said the pay rise would encourage people to join the aged care sector. While Bupa Villages and Aged Care Australia Managing Director Andrew Kincaid said the decision was an important first step towards recognition of the critical role our aged care workforce plays in caring for our elderly. Now, Mr Speaker, despite those opposite, despite their newfound concern for the state of the aged care sector, a concern that they looked inside and discovered with themselves on or around the 22nd of May, by my observation, do not think that workers deserve a pay rise. They do not want workers to earn more. Matthias Cormann belled the cat on that years ago. And the Shadow Treasurer was good enough to reconfirm this recently when he said the quiet part out loud. So those opposite, when they were in government, refused to make a submission to the Fair Work Commission to support a pay rise for aged care workers, and they rushed through changes that scrapped the Aged Care Workforce Compact that would have seen a pay rise for aged care workers. It was one of the very first things that they did. They suspended standing orders. Such was their giddy rush to cut pay rises for aged care workers. It was foolhardy, it was cruel and it was short-sighted. And aged care workers judged them for their actions then, not what they mumble now. Yeah. So I want to thank those staff, the union members in the sector who fought against them for this interim pay rise that they so thoroughly deserve.
The Minister's time has concluded. Give the call to the Leader of the Nationals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How many gigajoules of gas supply will be lost to families and small businesses because the government cut $50 million from gas investment projects?
Call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
None, Mr Speaker, but I welcome a question from the opposition about gas, because these are the guys who promised a gas-led recovery. Remember that? How'd it go? What they left was a gas-led bin fire, Mr Speaker, a gas-led bin fire, because on the day that our old friend, the member for Hume, announced a gas-led recovery, the price of gas was $4.20 a gigajoule. The gas-led recovery went so well, but by the time of the election, the price of gas was $34.75 a gigajoule. Well done, Angus.
Order. Give the call to the member. I give the call to the member for Blair.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Early Childhood Education. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to get wages moving in feminised workforces like the early childhood education and care sector, and why is this needed?
Call to the Minister for Early Childhood Education and the Minister for Youth.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Blair for his question and for his continued commitment to see the wages of women in feminised industries lift. Mr Speaker, you won't hear anyone on this side of the House say that deliberately keeping wages low is a centrepiece of our economic agenda. Yeah. This government went to the election with a commitment to lift wages, and in just 5 months of being in office, we've already made progress to get wages moving. We've supported the Fair Work Commission to lift the minimum wage, including the Children's Services Award by 4.8%. We've committed to decreasing the gender pay gap across a number of industries, including early childhood education and care, where 90% or over 90% of workers in that sector are women, Mr Speaker. We're strengthening the ability of the Fair Work Commission to order pay increases for low-paid, female-dominated industries. We're establishing 2 expert panels, a pay equity panel and a care and community sector panel. We're expanding access to multi-employer bargaining. All of these will help to lift the wages of early childhood education and care workers. But, Mr Speaker, I'm asked, why is this needed? For one thing, we know that those industries which are female-dominated have been for too long in this country undervalued and overworked. And I commend the Minister for Aged Care and the work that she has done on increasing the wages for aged care workers. It is a demonstration of this government's commitment to pay equity for the feminised sectors, like early childhood education and care. Again, why is this needed? And I'd like to take a moment, Mr Speaker, to give the example of why multi-employer bargaining works and why it works and why it's necessary. I hear them over there all groaning and moaning, but you might want to listen to this example about why it works for early childhood educators and workers in your electorate. Early childhood educators in your electorates. In Melbourne, Mr Speaker, we have the example of a group of 70 not-for-profit early childhood education and care centres who bargained together for a multi-employer agreement covering all of them. In
through that process, that agreement set a minimum of 16% above the award. And they have the best conditions for long day care in Victoria. That's what multi-employer bargaining helped to achieve for these early childhood education and care workers. Under current laws, it is too cumbersome. We need to change the laws. Only one government will deliver higher employment and better employment for early childcare workers, and that's this side of the House.
Order. Give the call to the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Businesses in my electorate of Lindsay in Western Sydney, like Screaming Beans Cafe, are struggling with the pressure of rising inflation and power prices. Given the budget indicates that power prices will increase by 56%, why are businesses like Screaming Beans having to pay for the Prime Minister's broken promise to cut power prices?
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question. And this government is extremely concerned about power prices for businesses, small, medium and large, and power prices for industry and for residences as well. And this government has taken the approach of being straight with the Australian people about the pressures on energy prices, the pressures caused by very high coal and gas input costs. That's why we took the approach. We took the approach in the budget, and the Treasurer took the approach in the budget of being straight with the Australian people. There was an alternative approach. The alternative approach is not to be straight with the Australian people. We took option A, to be straightforward with the Australian people. The previous government took option B, of hiding those price rises. They are, in every sense, the B team, Mr Speaker. Option B was the one embraced by the member for Hume.
The Minister will resume his seat. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, on relevance, previously on the 1st of August you directed a minister to be relevant to the question where a minister had strayed and began talking about the record of the former government. They can't help themselves. He's done it again, and he should be directed back to the question.
Yes, the Minister has set some context 1 minute in. I'm going to ask him to return to the specific broken promises alleged in the question and also the rising power prices, which was also in the question which he's referring to. And I call the Minister.
Mr Speaker, in relation to rising power prices, that's the option they took. And there's been even a development in recent days, Mr Speaker, on this important topic, which will be of interest to the House, because previously the member for Hume denied hiding the power price rises, said it didn't happen. Then he said he didn't know about the power price rises when he changed the law. And then last week at the National Press Club, he said, I was acting on departmental advice, Mr Speaker. How pathetic to blame your public servants for your decision, Mr Speaker. That's how pathetic these guys are, blaming the department. That's what they've lowered to.
The Leader of the Nationals.
In the House, we take the alternative approach. That's why the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Industry Minister, the Resources Minister and myself have made it very clear. We will not be standing by and watching the prices of coal and gas just flow through to Australian industries and households. That's what you did, and you didn't have the guts to tell the Australian people that you couldn't help them with power prices. You hid it from the Australian people. That's how pathetic you got, and that's how pathetic you still are.
Order. Before I call the member for Hawke, I just remind all ministers to direct their comments through the chair. And I give the call to the member for Hawke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What is the Albanese Labor government's approach to wages in the budget, and why is it so important to get wages moving?
And I call the Treasurer.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for Hawke for the question and for all the work that he does on behalf of his community here in this place. Getting wages growing again is a deliberate design feature of our economic policy, and that's why we do need to fix what is a broken bargaining system, which is only delivering stagnant wages, particularly for the low-paid and for industries dominated by women. It's why the budget is all about investing in skills so we can train people for higher wage opportunities. It's about early childhood education, making it cheaper so more parents can work more and earn more if they want to. It's about investing in the industries where we'll get the secure, well-paid jobs, whether it be areas of traditional strength or new industries as well. It's why we have started to provision for the important wage outcome that has been announced, interim wage outcome announced by the Fair Work Commission for aged care workers. And it's why one of the first decisions, if not the very first decision of the Cabinet of this new government, was to support a decent minimum wage rise. Now, in the budget, Mr Speaker, the Treasury has upgraded their forecast for wages growth to be 3.75% this year and next, and if it happens, that will be the fastest since 2012, and that would be a good thing. But what we do know is that when inflation is high and rising, it makes it even harder for Australians to keep up. And part of the reason for that is that for too long in this country, Mr Speaker, wages have been too stagnant. And that has made it harder for people to keep up and harder for people to get ahead. Under the life of the previous government, wages growth was just 2.1% on average, compared with 3.6% under the Labor government that preceded it. And so you can see that for the best part of a decade we've had wage stagnation. Now, Mr Speaker, nothing would make those opposite happier than another decade of wage stagnation and wage suppression. That's what they're here for. And we know this because the Shadow Treasurer was asked on TV why he opposed our industrial relations changes, and he said because it will push wages up, which is kind of the point. And it says it all about the differences between this side of the House and that side of the House, Mr Speaker. We have policies and plans to get wages moving again. We want Australian workers to get a bigger slice of the action when the economy is growing, and they failed on wages, and ordinary people copped it in the neck as a consequence. So, Mr Speaker, there's a very important reason why the Minister for Skills has been investing in skills. The Ministers for Education and Early Childhood Education have been investing in cheaper childcare. It's why the Minister for Industry has been investing in our supply chains and the industries that will deliver secure, well-paid work. It's why the Minister for Aged Care, working with the Minister for Health, has been so supportive of a decent pay rise for our aged care workers. It's why the Prime Minister during the campaign, the Industrial Relations Minister afterwards, all of the Cabinet been so supportive of a decent minimum wage rise. That's because we want to see wages growing again. You would happily see another decade of wage stagnation.
Give the call to the member for Fowler.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer tell the House how can the government offer additional childcare relief for those earning up to $530,000 while removing the low and middle income tax offset for individuals and families earning less than $120,000 who need tax relief the most during a cost of living crisis? How will the government provide immediate relief for struggling families like those in Fowler? Thank you.
Give a call to the Treasurer.
Once again, Mr Speaker, I appreciate the question from the member for Fowler and thank her for the conversations that we've had about cost of living in the past. We do recognise and we do understand that when inflation is high and rising for longer than we would like, then Australian families and Australians more broadly are under more pressure than we would like. When it comes to the low and middle income tax offset, that was a decision taken by our predecessors to end the LMITO, and that has ended. That's a decision that my predecessor, former Treasurer Frydenberg, made very clear. What we have tried to do in the budget and what we have done in the budget is to provide cost of living relief to your constituents and to all of our constituents in a way that doesn't add to inflation in our economy. We recognise that the reason why real wages are going backwards is because inflation is too high for too long. We recognise that interest rates are going up because inflation is higher than we want it to be, and that is largely a consequence of pressures coming from around the world, but it's felt around the kitchen tables of our communities. And so the cost of living relief that we're providing in the budget, whether it be cheaper early childhood education, whether it be expansion of paid parental leave, whether it be the housing accord to get more cheaper rental properties into the market, whether it be cheaper medicines, whether it be our policies to get wages moving again. All of these things are all about providing the cost of living relief that people need and deserve in a way that isn't counterproductive by making the inflation problem even worse. So that's the government's strategy here. The alternative would be to risk making the inflation problem worse, but there is something like $7.5 billion of cost of living relief flowing in the budget. Obviously, as we go through these challenging times, if there's more that we can responsibly do, obviously we will consider it, and we'll always try and do the right thing by her constituents and by all the people that we represent in this place.
The call to the member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Minister for Workplace Relations. How will the Albanese Labor government's Secure Jobs Better Pay Bill help close the gender pay gap, and how has this policy been received?
Give the call to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations and the Minister for the Arts.
Thanks very much, Speaker, and I thank the member for Gilmore and thank her for her commitment as well, acknowledge her commitment in taking action to close the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap in Australia sits at an unacceptable 4.1%. It won't fix itself. We need to take action in legislation and action in the parliament to be able to close the gender pay gap, and you will find throughout the Secure Jobs Better Pay Bill specific measures designed to close the gender pay gap, every one of which those opposite are opposing. The first thing that we're doing is inserting gender equity as an objective of the Act, so it's there in the consideration of every decision of the Commission. We are then also fully implementing Recommendation 28 of the Respect at Work report, something which was put to the parliament in the previous term and which those opposite voted against implementing Recommendation 28 of the Respect at Work report. But this will allow disputes over sexual harassment to be dealt with at the Fair Work Commission, a cheaper jurisdiction, a more practical jurisdiction, and often where you have workplace disputes, they involve a number of issues. Sexual harassment is one of them, and we've had a situation where people have had to deal with different aspects of the same problem in different jurisdictions. You'll now be able to have that simplicity because of the measures within the bill. Importantly as well, a prohibition on pay secrecy clauses. How many times has it been the case that these clauses have been used quite deliberately? So at the same workplace, women are paid less than men, but no one can find out. People have a right. If they have a clause where they want to keep their pay secret, they have a right. They don't have an obligation to disclose your own pay. But an employer should never say to a worker, you have no right to tell someone how much you're paid. It's been part of the elaborate story of making sure at various workplaces, particularly, I have to say, in the finance industry, where women have been paid less than men. But also, to get wages moving, we need to increase access to bargaining. You look at the moment, we're down to 14% of the workforce that are on agreements that are in date, agreements that get you above the award. The majority of those agreements are in occupations that are viewed as traditionally male-dominated. A minority are in jobs that are traditionally female-dominated. The current bargaining system won't deliver pay equity, and the rules there need to be changed. In terms of complexity, we are using 3 streams which already exist for multi-employer bargaining, but getting rid of the complexity so that they can be available and we can move to close the gender pay gap.
Give the call to the member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister please explain why NDIS workers and soldiers will be subject to the National Anti-Corruption Commission, but union officials exercising a power under a law of the Commonwealth will have a specific exclusion?
Order. I give the call to the Prime Minister. Order. Members on my left will cease interjecting. The member for O'Connor was heard in silence. The Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question. He seems unaware that, of course, people in the industrial relations system are covered by the Fair Work Ombudsman as well as the Fair Work Commission. The Fair Work Commission, and they're subject to that. And one of the things that we've done with the National Anti-Corruption Commission, in part, he might want to talk to the Leader of the Opposition about this, because he's made it very clear that what we shouldn't do with the National Anti-Corruption Commission is duplicate systems that are in place already. So if you look at, for example, parliamentarians with IPEA, for example, are excluded from the NAC provisions. They've done that. As a result of the clear indication from those opposite that I agree with as well, that what you need to do with the National Anti-Corruption Commission is fill the gaps which are there. You don't need to duplicate laws and provisions which are available already.
I give the call to the member for Macarthur.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to address housing affordability? How does the budget help Australians
manage cost of living pressures?
Give the call to the Minister for Small Business, Housing and Homelessness.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Macarthur because I know that he, like many people on this side of the House, and I'm sure those on the other side, are concerned about the cost of living and particularly about housing affordability, which is why, of course, in our budget we focused on cost of living measures that will not put pressure on inflation, such as cheaper childcare, cheaper medicines, getting wages moving, expanding paid parental leave and more affordable housing, Mr Speaker. Indeed, one of the central parts of the budget was the new National Housing Accord. Importantly, it's been agreed by each tier of government, by investors and industry. It is a commitment to work together to address the systematic problems that we have in the housing market. And of course, it will be guided, as will of course our overall architecture in terms of housing, by our National Supply and Affordability Council. It will be providing advice to governments to make sure that we are dealing with supply to get more affordable homes on the ground more quickly. Indeed, we want to remove the barriers to get more affordable homes on the ground more quickly. And we are delivering right across the housing spectrum with the budget. The Housing Australia Future Fund, 30,000 social and affordable homes across the country, our Help to Buy scheme, and importantly our regional first home buyer guarantee, which was due to start on 1 January next year, which we brought forward to the 1st of October. And I'm pleased to tell the House that since the 1st of October, 574 people have actually taken up the scheme in regional Australia to get into their first home. That is good news for those first home buyers in regional Australia. That is just since the 1st of October.
The member for Deakin will cease interjecting.
We have said through the Jobs and Skills Summit that we would work quickly to get money on the ground in terms of widening the remit of the National Housing Infrastructure Facility, Mr Speaker. And I'm pleased to advise the House that this week we have indeed set out to amend the National Housing Infrastructure Facility up to $575 million to deliver more social and affordable homes with the money available before Christmas. That is before Christmas. In just a few weeks' time, that money will be available to get more social and affordable homes on the ground. Indeed, it is part of our overall architecture and our election commitments, but also the Accord as part of the budget, and long-term the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. As the CEO of Hester Superfund said, there's no single solution to this housing crisis, but all levels of government have a role to play. That's why it's fantastic to see this framework for all stakeholders to come together to overcome the challenges, because now is the time to get the policy settings right. Mr Speaker, our investments are right for the times, they're right for the future, and they'll deliver more social and affordable homes for Australians to get more Australians into a home.
Give the call to the Leader of the Australian Greens.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Greedy energy corporations are driving up electricity bills by 56% while making massive record profits. Prime Minister, will you back the Greens' costed plan to freeze electricity bills for 2 years at pre-crisis levels, funded by a windfall tax on coal and gas corporations, to deliver people immediate cost of living relief?
I give the call to the Prime Minister.
What we'll be doing, I thank the member from Melbourne for his question, and I thank him for the constructive engagement as well. I understand that we have different solutions that we would present in dealing with the challenge of climate change, but I don't doubt his sincerity in wanting to deal with it. And that's the starting point, is acknowledging the science which is there. But we went to the election with a very clear plan, our Powering Australia plan, that acknowledges the changes that are required in our economy that will provide for an 82% share of our energy mix to be renewables by 2030. And we understand that that is the cheapest and cleanest form of new energy. I know that on a number of areas, housing, energy, in these areas, we have had propositions stating we could just take action of freezing payments as is put forward by the member for Melbourne. But it's completely unclear to me and upon any legal advice of how you would do that in terms of intervening in the way in which the member for Melbourne has suggested. What the government has to do is to come up with practical plans that make a practical difference. We did that in June by making sure that the lights stayed on. We did that in the negotiations that took place with gas suppliers to make sure that we secured the greater than the 56 petajoules that was anticipated would be the shortfall by the ACCC, and we'll do that as we're working through the current solutions, working through with industry, working through with our departments, working through with manufacturers as well, because we understand that the increase that is occurring as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in global energy prices, that is feeding into global inflation as well, is a challenge for the economy. We'll deal with it with real solutions rather than slogans. That's the Labor way, and that's the responsibility that we have as a government.
Give the call to the member for Corwell.
My question is to the Minister for Education. How is the Albanese Labor government delivering responsible cost of living relief that is good for families and good for the economy?
Call to the Minister for Education.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my friend the member for Cornwall for her question. The first 5 years of a child's life are everything. What they see, what they hear, what they eat, every smile, every laugh, every friend, every book, every lesson shapes the people that we become.
Member for New England.
And that's why early childhood education is so important. Now, I would hope that the member for New England in particular might know that. He might also know, as I do, as a father of young children, that early childhood education is expensive. That the cost has gone up by 41% in the last 8 years. And that's why the legislation that we've introduced into the parliament is so important, because it'll cut the cost of childcare for more than 1 million Australian families. For, on average, 6,000 families in each and every electorate represented in this parliament. For a family on a combined income of about $120,000, it means that they will save about $1,700 a year. So it's good for children, as the member for New England knows.
The Nationals will cease interjecting.
It's good for mums and dads, as the member for New England knows. And it's good for our economy as well, because in a skills-starved economy, this will help a lot of skilled workers to go back into the workforce. According to Treasury, the equivalent of up to 37,000 extra full-time workers. It's why our cheaper childcare legislation has won such widespread support. Good Start have called it groundbreaking. Georgie Dent from the Parenthood said it will help improve financial independence and security for Australian women. The BCA said affordable childcare is fundamental to increasing workforce participation of Australian women. And I also want to thank members of the crossbench. The member for Warringah described it as an investment in our future as a nation. The member for Mackellar said not only is it sensible economic policy, it'll provide our children with the best possible start in life. And the member for Wentworth said, and I quote, "No other bill gives me greater joy to see in front of the parliament today." The only people that have criticised it are the Liberal Party and the National Party. They've opposed it relentlessly for 2 years. Not one person from the Liberal Party or the National Party in the debate said anything in support of it. They didn't say one thing positive, except for the member for New England, who we can always rely on for support when it comes to early childhood education and care.
I'll ask the minister to resume his seat, and I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Again, it is on relevance. The question had nothing to do with this government's, with the record of this side of the House, and he's strayed again into the former government's record. I suggest he should be directed back to the question.
The Manager of Opposition Business, the member for Canning, is seeking the call? No. I'll call the minister to remain relevant for the last 18 seconds of his answer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So you might ask, why are they voting for it? Well, maybe it's because only 30% of Australian women voted for them. And they're afraid if they vote against this, then the same thing will happen to them again.
Call the member for Canning.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. The Prime Minister said he doesn't want duplication in the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Why is the ADF included in the National Anti-Corruption Commission, but senior union leaders are not? Isn't the ADF Military Code of Conduct and Inspector General good enough?
The call to the order. Members on my left, the member for Canning was heard in silence, and I'd ask the same respect to be shown to the Minister for Defence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question.
Member for Deakin.
The military tribunals have their important role to play. The government has committed to producing an anti-corruption commission which is going to be robust in accordance with the commitments that we took to the last election.
Order. Members on my left will cease interjecting. The House will come to order, and I'll call the member for Pearce.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. What were the findings of the Gaetjens report into the Community Sports Infrastructure Grant Programme, and why did it take so long for the report to be released?
Give the call to the... I'll just ask the order. Members on my right. The Attorney-General will take a break and I will listen to the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, again, Mr Speaker, it goes to questions being asked about actions of the previous government, which is not an appropriate source of subject of a question to a current minister.
I will hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, in terms of relevance, the question can only go to the consideration can only go to the words of the question itself. The question refers to a report which has now been released today. That's happened in the life of this government and therefore is completely relevant and within standing orders to ask the relevant minister.
Page 553 of practice. Order. On the point of order, does say that the relevant minister may answer questions they are responsible for concerning public affairs, administration and proceedings pending the House. In light of the information that a report was released today, which the Attorney-General has responsibility for, the question is in order, and I'll give him the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for Pearce for her question. It reflects her long-standing interest in integrity matters. And you've got to say that at the last election it's very clear that the Australian people voted for integrity, voted for transparency and voted for the return of good government. The Australian people roundly rejected the government's record of rorts and cover-ups, and one of the most egregious examples of those rorts and cover-ups was the so-called sports rort scandal, the report of which from the former Secretary of the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet has just been released. And what we've now learned is that it involved, this sports rort scandal, the former government ignoring recommendations from the relevant department and using colour-coded spreadsheets which carved up funds by electorate for party advantage rather than on any kind of merits assessment. It was shameful, and that's what we've learned. We find it out yesterday, after years of cover-up, that even the member for Cook's most senior public servant thought that it was wrong. He found that there were significant shortcomings in the scheme and that there was an actual conflict of interest. And of course, sports rorts weren't the only example under the former government of behaviour like this. We also had the car park rorts, we had the Leppington Triangle, we had the member for Hume's Grassgate scandal. The Australian people said enough, enough. They elected a government that is dedicated to integrity and transparency, and we've wasted no time honouring our commitment to the Australian people We've already introduced legislation for a National Anti-Corruption Commission with teeth, which is currently before a joint select committee. I am looking forward to the report of the committee being provided to this parliament this week on Thursday. We hope to pass the bill by the end of this year and have the commission up and running by mid-2023. And it could not be a starker contrast to the former government, who promised that they were going to establish a National Anti-Corruption Commission in December of 2018, and they never even introduced a bill. Unlike them, we promised a National Anti-Corruption Commission, and we will deliver.
And I call the Prime Minister.
I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Just got to call the Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to make a personal explanation.
Do you claim to be misrepresented?
Yes, I do, Mr Speaker.
You may proceed.
During question time today, the Attorney-General attributed quotes to me which are not accurate, and the aspersions within them are not accurate. The suggestion that I have somehow denigrated the people within the AAT, Mr Speaker, are not accurate, and the Attorney-General should know better.
And I give the call to the Leader of the House.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Just to add to an answer, Catherine Murphy picked up during my answer earlier that when I was referring to the gender pay gap, I used a lower number, and I had the right number in front of me.
On my left.
And of course, the correct number of 14.1% only makes the argument stronger that we need to act.
Order, and I call the House will come to order. And I call the Leader of the House with papers.
Mr Speaker, documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members earlier today. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.